So, the government of France collapsed. Again. Yeah, who could have possibly guessed? Certainly not me. You can probably hear the sarcasm in my voice. Yes, my friends, this past month, the government of France collapsed at the beginning of September. Again. And then guess what? It just collapsed again after that, like this week. Less than a month later.
You want to see me do it again?
Dear Lord, I have to say this. To all of you that are watching this right now, I want you to understand that I have actually been working on this video for the last week and a half or so at the time that I am recording this, and the line that I put in here regarding the previous collapse is, and I quote, because this is what I said from the previous version of the script, honestly, with how France has been politically and economically, I would be willing to make a bet that it is going to probably collapse again within the next year. And then it managed to beat that estimate by about 11 months. Moonbeam, I honestly blame you. I think you're the one at fault for all this. Don't you try to hide your shame. Yes, my friends, this is absolute insanity. In less than 2 years, France has gone through like 5 or 6 prime ministers, a political feat unsurpassed even in Rome's time of post-war political turbulence, which, as we all know historically, was truly something else. In this previous case, back at the beginning of September, France was plunged into yet another political crisis after the defeat of Prime Minister François Bayrou after a confidence vote in the National Assembly. The context of that is that a day earlier, 364 out of the 573 lawmakers who make up the National Assembly had voted against Bayrou's government, well above the 280 votes that are needed, after his attempt to force through an unpopular plan to tame France's ballooning budget deficit would fail miserably. But even with his removal, this wasn't exactly going to solve things. In fact, before he was ousted, Bayrou warned that getting rid of him was not going to resolve France's challenges, saying, and I quote, "You have the power to bring down the government, but you do not have the power to erase reality." End quote. This is what he said to lawmakers. Following it up with, "Reality will remain relentless, expenses will continue to rise, and the burden of debt, already unbearable, will grow heavier and more costly." End quote. The government of France just really doesn't seem to be able to do anything. President Macron has the, of course, very unenviable task of steering France out of its financial quicksand, something that threatens to consume the country, and political forces on both the left and right now seek to capitalize on the vacuum that has been created. The new prime minister, who got the job immediately after Bayrou, Sébastien Lecornu, would have the job for only 27 days, and his government would resign on Monday. Like at this point, that's what, October 6th? This being only hours after he would go and announce his cabinet lineup. The government in total would last something along the lines of 12 to 14 hours, depending upon what source you are pulling your information from, easily making it the shortest-lived administration in modern French history, and something that would only deepen the country's political crisis. The unexpected resignation would come after allies and foes alike would threaten to topple the new government, which Lecornu said meant that he obviously could not do his job. And so look, my friends, before it is that I go any further, I need to go ahead and clarify something right now. When I said that, oh, the French government collapsed, I do not want you to get the idea that this is like the French Revolution and they are about to break out the guillotine or something like that. No, nothing like that. This is actually a feature of French democracy, not a bug. So do not think that I am saying the country itself is collapsing. That is most certainly not the case. However, to say that France is in an okay position would also not be a true statement. Between its debt crisis, the migrant crisis, and rising popularity of more fringe political parties, France is now more unstable than it has been in quite literally decades. And of course, my friends, as we were talking about this, all the different sides are going to blame each other for what is to come. The left is going to blame the right is going to blame the left, and the center is going to blame, well, pretty much everyone but themselves. You can see this right now literally all across French media, and it is a nightmare to go and sort through, which is why I'm incredibly proud to be sponsored by Ground News, which is the source that I use in order to be able to sort all the varying different biases across the internet, because let's face it, in today's day and age, if you don't utilize a service like Ground News, you're pretty much going to be awash with propaganda literally all the time. Ground News is by far my favorite tool on this channel. It allows me to go and sort varying different sources by their biases, see who owns said sources, whether they're owned by the government or private entity. It also allows me to check their factuality and see if there's any different sources that are focusing on one subject but completely ignoring another with their blind spot feature. As France becomes more embattled along ideological lines, if I did not have something like Ground News, I would be in some serious trouble right now. And I highly recommend to any of you that are watching this, you need to get this service. If you go to groundnews.com/historyofeverything, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I use in order to be able to present information to you all. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring this video, and Well, let's try to make sense of all this now. The biggest problem hanging over the state is its debt and slow-growing economy. At a whopping 3.3 trillion euros in June of 2025, or 114% of GDP, the position that France is in is not a good one. And now, to be fair, when I talk about this, because I know there's already going to be comments that are going to be mentioning this, yes, that is lower than Greece's 153% or Italy's 138% debt to GDP ratio, but unlike France, both countries run considerable budget surpluses before it is that they take interest payments into account and are able to actually deal with that debt in arguably a more effective manner. In fact, the Cour des Comptes audit office within France would warn earlier this year that French debt payments, on the other hand, are set to reach more than 100 billion euros by 2029, which is up from 59 billion in 2024, becoming the single biggest budget expense if growth slows or deficit reduction is relaxed. The cost of servicing national debt this year alone is estimated to be 67 billion euro, and it now consumes more money than all government departments except for education and defense, and it is likely to outstrip all of that if it hasn't done that already at this point. Honestly, when trying to find details on the French budget, it was annoying to sift through everything. This debt is going to siphon away billions of euros that would have otherwise gone into different aspects of French society, industry, and more. It simply does not have the ability to invest in itself further. Meanwhile, Germany plans to invest billions of euros in its own economy after years of restraint, which leaves France in a rather unflattering light considering that it has been the second biggest and is likely to continue to drop. As Oxford economics economist Leo Barnacle would say, quote, "The situation is improving everywhere except in France, which has become somewhat of an ugly duckling," end quote. He would go on to say that with continuous slow growth and huge debt, Italy has long been Europe's problem child for finances, but now it seems that France is clearly becoming that country, end quote. This is not a good look. And then, on top of all that, the ratings agency of Fitch would downgrade French debt from AA to A+, potentially making it more expensive for the French government to borrow, something that it has to do to keep running in the first place, reflecting growing doubts about the country's ability and stability to be able to service its own debt. The fact of the matter is, there is a real chance that France is going to have to turn to the International Monetary Fund for some kind of loan, or it is going to need intervention from the European Central Bank. This is not a crazy thought any longer. This is a very real possibility, something that is extremely uncomfortable to both French politicians as well as the French public, which we're going to be getting into here later as to why they don't really want anyone to mess with their benefits. And all of this, my friends, that I'm explaining is occurring against a background of international turmoil. The immigration crisis, war in Eastern Europe, trade disputes with the United States, and of course, the rise of further left and further right-wing populist parties in the state and across Europe. It is not an easy or clean situation. And the question, of course, as always, my friends, is how exactly did we get here? Is France really in that bad of a position? And what exactly is going to happen next? Well, to that end, sit back and let's go ahead and dive into some context because this is going to be revolutionary. Okay, not really. No, we're not going that far back. It was a joke. It was simply a joke because, of course, we're talking about things within France. In comparison to when we have talked about Greece or some other states on this channel and their own debt crises, we do not need to go back that far for France. After all, unlike Greece, tax evasion was not seen as a form of patriotism for several hundred years. If you haven't seen that video that I did on Greece, you definitely go back and check that out. However, we do need to go back over a century in order to be able to understand why the French state of today looks the way that it does and how that has helped to fuel its problems in the first place. Not quite a century, but into the last century. To begin, we need to look for a moment at the 30-year period prior to 1974, which was the last year that France had a budget surplus. After that, it was just continuous sliding further and further into debt until it is that we get to where it is we are today. As I'm sure that all of us are aware, World War II happened. Yes, it did. And it sucked. And because of that, many bad things happened. Especially in France, which was occupied by the Germans, and its wealth extracted to fuel the war machine of the German Reich. Now, while rough initially, of course, the hardships of wartime and the immediate post-war period were succeeded by a period of steady economic development, which in French history is now often fondly recalled as the 30 Glorious Years. a time in which French citizens' living standards would experience unprecedented levels of growth and stability, and those in the US could also likely draw parallels to. On average, the economy would grow by a whopping 5% per year, which in most developed economies is next to impossible to do consistently. During the 1950s, agricultural productivity soared. France went from being an importer of food to meet the needs of its population to self-sufficiency and surplus output. Between 1946 and the end of the 1960s, the population would grow by a record 30%. By 1967, 1 in 3 adults was under the age of 20, the perfect age to be thrown into university or the workforce or something like that. Population growth was due not only to a higher birth rate, but also to a declining mortality rate fueled by improvements in medical care, housing, and nutrition. The infant mortality rate would drop from 52 in 1950 to 18.2 in 1970. It is quite frankly amazing, and into the setting we have the perfect setup for success. There's plentiful food and basic needs being met, you have a healthy working age population, and heavy investments that are being made into society and businesses at large in order to fuel industry. In 1950, the average income in France was about 55% of that of an American, and this would go all the way to reaching 80% in 1973. They really seem to be catching up. Between 1960 and 1975, income per capita almost doubled. And among the major nations, the only ones who could claim faster growth than this were Japan and Spain. That is it. France was third out of the entire world. It was simply astounding. As for how they did this, they would alternate policies of interventionist and free market ideas, which would enable France to build a society in which both industry and technological advances could be made, but also worker security and privileges were established and protected. This is something that the French people are fiercely proud of. So it was then that by the end of the 20th century, France was once again among the leading economic powers of the world. Although, that being said, by the year 2000, there were some issues that definitely were there, but they were not so obvious or bad yet necessarily that they were a major problem. Yet. But it's okay. Those could always be dealt with later and the can kicked down the road, right? Well, after this absolutely glowing review in which I just seem to have been glazing France, the problems of today also began to take root around this time as well. By the late 1960s, France's economic growth, while yes, still strong, was beginning to lose steam. Due to the impact of the 1968 social upheaval on the French economy, speculators would bet against the French franc. The financial pressure from currency outflows would lead to the government devaluing the franc against the German mark and the US dollar in 1969. And only a few short years later, the 30 glorious years would come crashing down in 1973 as the oil crisis would enter full swing. And that wasn't good for just about anyone in the West. The 1973 oil shock had a significant impact on the French economy, leading to a slowdown in growth and rising inflation. The country, like many others, was forced to adjust to higher energy prices and a more volatile global economic environment. This period would also see the rise of stagflation, a combination of high inflation, but also economic stagnation where nothing appeared to really be developing. In response to the oil shock, France would implement a series of economic reforms aimed at improving competitiveness as well as reducing its own dependence on oil. These included efforts to diversify its energy sources, promote energy efficiency, and reduce reliance specifically on imported oil. But despite these efforts, the economic challenges of the 1970s would lead to significant social unrest. Workers and students would protest against government policies and demanded better working conditions and higher wages. The government often would respond with concessions, but these measures sometimes just exacerbated financial issues because if you have no money and you continue to give people money, it kind of hurts when you don't have anything. The people of France were now used to getting strong benefits. Any of those being taken away would be met with intense resistance, which, on a little bit of a side note, sounds like a spoiler for the issues that are faced today, but we're going to be getting to that. This is not a new thing in France, my friends. As I said, the government responded to economic troubles and social unrest by simply spending more money than it had. And from that point, it never really stopped. This period marked the beginning of a trend of using public funds to buffer economic shocks, and that would continue all the way to the current day and age. Under President Mitterrand, France would initially pursue a Keynesian approach with increased public spending and nationalization of industries. However, this led to high inflation as well as a weakened currency, hurting much of the French public. By the mid-1980s, the government would shift to a more liberal economic policy, implementing austerity measures, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and reducing public money to stabilize the economy as well as meet the Maastricht criteria. Which, I'm saying that right now, I need to go ahead and clarify. I spoke about it before in relation to my video that I did on Greece, but this is the early point of trying to set up what would become the European Union. The Maastricht Treaty required member states to keep their government debt below 60% of GDP and deficits under 3% of GDP. So, they couldn't spend more than 3% deficit each year. France has struggled to meet these targets, especially in recent years, oftentimes running much higher deficits in its yearly budget. But we'll get to that here later and you'll see how bad it is. Privatization would proceed over the course of the 90s. Inflation would remain mostly under control, and the introduction of the euro, the single European currency, in January of 1999 would boost competition as well as investment across Europe as a whole. Yet, despite these boons, unemployment would still stubbornly hover around 12% over the last decade of the century, which would cast doubt on the hope that growth and social progress were able to be met at the same time. So what to do then? Well, over the course of the early 2000s, a kind of socioeconomic balancing act remained in place, which would pit the popularity of progressive social legislation and benefits against the difficulties of what you would need in order to make any of that possible in the first place. High taxes, restrictive social security demands on employers, and precarious funding for health and welfare projects, even when there was no money to actually do it. Still, that all being said, the early 2000s were characterized by decent economic growth in France, driven by global economic expansion and increased consumer spending. This period saw a reduction in the budget deficit and a slight improvement in the debt-to-GDP ratio, though this was not to last as things began to stagnate around 2005, and the global financial crisis roller coaster was about to take off in 2008. Yeah, every single time I have to make a video about something that is going on in the modern day and age, and it's usually dealing with the debt crisis or economic bubble or something like that, we're going to end up talking about 2008. France, like most countries, was affected in the 2008 financial crisis. However, that all being said, interestingly enough, during the worst part of the crisis between 2008 and 2010, France actually fared significantly better than a lot of other countries did. As just an example of this, the Eurozone's overall GDP decreased by 4%, which is a pretty big contraction. But France's GDP only decreased by around 2.2%. Yeah, of course, that is still not good, but it could have been way worse. Just look at Greece if you're curious. As such, it is genuinely impressive, but how did they do this, you may wonder? Well, that is largely because of public spending and social safety nets. France's social protection system would handle around 47% of its total household income spending in 2007, which meant that it was way less vulnerable to fluctuating private shocks, which arguably at this point is a good thing. However, these stabilizers have the opposite effect on recovery. Just because things don't drop as bad, simultaneously they do not recover as fast, and they thus have slower growth afterwards. Starting in 2012, many countries would experience massive economic recoveries, but an analysis of the indicators of economic activity in France do not really show a clear recovery. Instead, there is barely any growth at all, or just completely stagnates. This, as you can imagine, is definitely not a good thing, and France had to make some kind of change. And for that, a new political force would have to come into power, but the road ahead was not necessarily looking too bright. In April and May of 2012, France held presidential elections, in which the winner, Holland, had opposed austerity measures, promising to eliminate France's budget deficit by 2017, which is a really big promise to make, mind you. The new government stated that it aimed to cancel recently enacted tax cuts and exemptions for the wealthy, raising the top tax bracket up to 75% on incomes that were over €1 million, restoring the retirement age to 60 with full pension for those who had worked 42 years, restoring 60,000 jobs that had recently been cut from public education, regulating rent increases, and building additional housing for the poor. A lot of promises were made. And those promises, it seems, worked. In June of 2012, Holland's Socialist Party won an overall majority in the legislative elections, giving it the capability to amend the French constitution and allowing immediate enactment of all the promised reforms. Under President François Hollande, France would implement a series of austerity measures, including $30 billion in spending cuts and tax increases totaling €20 billion. These measures aim to reduce the budget deficit from 5.2% of GDP in 2011 down to 3% by 2013, as required by Eurozone rules. The government introduced the Responsibility and Solidarity Pact in 2014, which included measures to reduce labor costs for businesses and encourage hiring. However, these reforms were largely met with resistance from trade unions and led to severe social unrest. Still, were they successful? Not necessarily. Despite the reforms, unemployment remained high, reaching a peak of 10.5% in 2015, an extremely high unemployment rate, especially for a Western developed country. Youth unemployment was particularly severe, exceeding 20% in some regions, leading to social tensions as well as mass protests. And so, my friends, it is here that I want to touch upon a rather sensitive issue for France, something that I'm sure that if there are any French viewers that are watching this right now, I'm probably going to receive a number of angry comments in the comment section, or there will be some grudging acknowledgement for what I'm about to say. Retirement and pensions. I'm sure that many people have already seen videos talking about how great it is to live in countries in Europe like France, where there are great social safety nets. Outsiders who live in countries where the retirement age is higher than 64 or 65 or something like that think that the French are extremely lucky and they have nothing to complain about since they have it so good as workers. I mean, 35-hour workweek averages, and on top of that, being able to retire by the age of 60 as you were able to do over the course of the early 2010s, that sounds amazing. With a robust national healthcare system and more government support, it means that a person could retire and live for another 23 years, as the average life expectancy in France is 83 years old. That sounds amazing. 23 years living off of benefits, being able to do whatever you want in your twilight years? Awesome! Except, wait, where is that money coming from? To actually support the people who do not work and need far more care than a young worker. That is where we start to run into a problem. This kind of system was great over the course of the late 1900s, where there were very few people that were pensioners and the majority of the population were young working age adults. But by the 2010s, the average age of the French population was not in their early 20s, like it was 40 years prior. It was more like around 40. Combine that with a birth rate that was below replacement level since the 1970s, and you have an aging population that will continue to drain far more money out of the welfare system than it provided until there is nothing left. And that is a problem. As president, Holland would pursue reform to the pension system in France. The process proved to be very contentious, with members of parliament, labor unions, and the general public being all opposed. Mass protests and demonstrations would occur throughout Paris. And despite the opposition, the French parliament would pass a reform in December of 2013, which aimed at plugging a pension deficit expected to reach 20.7 billion euros or $28.4 billion by 2020 if nothing were to be done. The way that they were going to do this was that rather than raising the mandatory retirement age, as many economists had advised as being necessary, Holland would instead pursue increases in contributions, leaving the retirement age untouched. So people would simply pay more. Yeah, no one was really happy about this. The reform had a rough ride in Parliament, being rejected twice by the Senate, where Holland's Socialist Party had only a slim majority before it won sufficient backing in the final vote before the lower house of Parliament. The French private sector workers would see the size and duration of their pension contributions increase only modestly under the reform, while their retirement benefits were largely untouched. It merely kicked the can down the road a bit. So yeah, not great, but it was a temporary solution. That can of worms was kicked down the road a bit rather than opened, but France's finances were only going to get worse. To understand how bad things were getting, you need to understand that France's public debt to GDP ratio would rise from 64% of GDP in 2007 to 85% by 2011 alone, driven by stimulus spending as well as bank bailouts. This would increase the cost of borrowing and raised questions about the sustainability of France's fiscal policies. But hey, it's all right. As long as there were no major shocks that would occur to the system again, everything was going to be fine, right? Surely nothing else is going to happen. Yeah, welcome to the 2010s. Now, for those of you watching from the United States, this may sound a little bit odd because the 2010s weren't necessarily all that bad. But for France and large parts of Europe, there were many issues that took place, especially the migration crisis. And before I go any further, I need to clarify for the sake of this video, my friends, that this video is more on the French debt crisis and political instability rather than migration, but it would be irresponsible for me to not mention the migration crisis that has been both a temporary solution to a number of France's problems, and yet also it simultaneously is one of the largest frustrations felt by the French population, leading to widespread social unrest. This, in turn, has contributed to the rise of more fringe political parties and, well, we're going to get to where it is that we are today soon. To clarify, immigration is nothing new in France. It just has become way more drastic, and I need to specify that right now. France experienced significant labor shortages following World War II. And so in order to address this, the French government did encourage immigration, especially from its former colonies in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and this period would see a large influx of Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians and other areas, which would give France a massive boost in terms of its workforce. But in the mid-2010s, the Syrian refugee crisis, as well as other factors, led to millions of people leaving from the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa to seek better conditions and opportunities in Europe. France, along with other EU countries, faced a surge in asylum seekers as well as economic migrants, largely young, working-age, or military-age men, despite the fact that initially the claims about the whole crisis was that it was primarily families with women and children. But that was not true. Not at all. The country struggled to accommodate these refugees, which further burdened the already overstretched welfare state, leading to the establishment of makeshift camps across the country, such as the Jungle in Calais, for anyone who is curious and wants to look that up. From this new surge in population, France and other European states facing an aging population crisis would gain access to a new source of labor, filling positions for industries that struggled to find workers and created an additional tax base to draw from, which, did provide some sense of relief, but at the same time, most of this new population drew far more financial benefits on average than they provided. When you combine this with huge spikes in crime, and you have the perfect recipe for social unrest that continues to this day, and you will see the rise in more right-wing anti-immigration parties. This was a really bad crisis, something that technically speaking is still ongoing, but things were fairly manageable as long as nothing else happened. And then guess what? Things happened. After Emmanuel Macron came into power in the latter 2010s, we would subsequently see the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by the European energy crisis from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And this would send things spiraling. Yeah, for anyone who has seen any videos on this similar topic, I'll say this right now, this here is the point that people usually start from when describing the problems that France faces. But of course, with us being the history of everything, we had to go back further, otherwise we wouldn't have the context leading to where it is that we are today. All of this was necessary to talk about, and really, the 2010s is just where it gets particularly bad. France's economic growth would remain modest over the years, averaging around 1% per year or less from 2014 to 2016, which is not good at all. This slow recovery was attributed to the lingering effects of the crisis, high unemployment, and the impact of austerity measures. In the end, Emmanuel Macron would be elected president of France in May of 2017, running on a pro-European and pro-reform platform. His election was seen as a victory for the centrist and pro-business agenda, which promised to reduce unemployment, stimulate economic growth, and reform the labor market. Which, that last part is something I need to really stress here. One of Macron's key initiatives was labor market reform, which aimed to make it easier for companies to hire and fire employees. Something that, has been a great boon for French job security, which people all over the internet talk about for how nice this is, but at the same time, it really weakened French businesses that were unable to remove underperforming employees, making business less profitable. Like it or not, my friends, French workers are simply not as productive as other workers around the world at similar development levels. They are not. French businesses just really were not all that good, and they still aren't to this day. And this whole thing was part of a broader effort to increase the flexibility of these businesses to reduce unemployment in the long term because they themselves would become more profitable and able to hire more people. But these reforms were met with significant resistance from trade unions as well as workers, leading to widespread protests and strikes. So it was not great. But at the time that we're talking about things here, it wasn't terrible yet necessarily. In the early years of Macron's presidency, France experienced modest economic growth, which helped to reduce the debt to GDP ratio slightly. However, this growth was not sufficient to address the underlying structural issues of the French economy, such as high unemployment and the low productivity that I just mentioned. So, despite these reforms, France's public debt would just continue to rise, and this was only to get much worse as the pandemic was going to hit. At 8 p.m. on March 16th, 2020, 5 years ago at this point, President Emmanuel Macron would announce the lockdown of the French population. 2 days later, just before midnight, the European Central Bank would open the floodgates of credit, announcing a €750 billion emergency intervention plan, which would eventually rise to €1.7 trillion. The time had come for free money. Governments were able to borrow like never before, at interest rates that were close to zero and eventually would become zero in order to pay for the national healthcare effort, the salaries of people that were forced to stay at home, and emergency loans for businesses to keep them afloat. And this, my friends, was not a unique thing. A large part of the planet, including all of Europe and the United States, did exactly the same thing. Anything and everything was done to try and keep economies afloat. So you can't exactly just blame France for this. But what you can blame France for, and Germany and the UK and pretty much every other major European state, is the dependency that they would develop upon Russia and its oil, because come 2022 and 2023, at the heels of the pandemic, you would have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, leading to mass sanctions across Europe against Russian oil and gas, the very things that were necessary to keep the modern industrial economies going, thus driving up prices everywhere for everything. I don't usually give my judgment on these kinds of things, but I will point this out here right now. This was incredibly stupid. Practically overnight, it would seem, French debt would soar past 100% of GDP to 114% of GDP by 2020. As interest payments would pile up over the early 2020s, they would grow at such a rate that they were beginning to outstrip education and other welfare services. This was a disaster waiting to blow up in the face of the state. Something had to be done. Cuts had to be made. Taxes and revenue had to be increased, or else the entire French project could straight up fall apart overnight as funding runs out. So, what does the government do? They go after pensions again. Yeah, see, I told you this earlier that I would have to talk more about it, and this is just one example of where France has a really big problem, but again, it is arguably one of the biggest problems considering countries that have an aging population crisis. As Gru once said, in terms of money,
we have no money.
I say that in a joking manner, but it is absolutely true. The issue of pension reforms has been dealt with by various different French governments over recent decades, but really, there has been no proper solution that can actually make the people of France happy and be long-lasting or viable. It is pretty much impossible. France has one of the lowest retirement ages for an industrialized country and spends more than most countries do on pensions, with at one point it amounting to like 14% of the entire economic output of the state. France's pension system is largely built on a pay-as-you-go structure, with both workers and employers being assessed mandatory payroll taxes that are used to fund retiree pensions. Compared to other European countries, France possesses one of the lowest rates of pensioners at risk of poverty due to just how incredibly generous these benefits are. It really is a great thing on paper. However, generous does not mean sustainable. In this case, the welfare state of France is impossible to maintain. To put this into perspective, in the year 2000, there were 2.1 workers paying into the system for every one retiree. In 2020, that ratio had fallen to 1.7. It would have been even worse if not for the fact that mass immigration over the course of the 2010s would bring in more workers, even though they would in turn draw more benefits than they would actually provide, but that's a whole other thing entirely. By 2070, it is expected to drop to 1.2, according to official projections. That is an insane level of tax burden for one person to have. It means that they are going to reach a point where for every one person you have working, you have one person that is retired, meaning all the taxes that they pay are going to end up going straight into just the retirement pension of someone else who isn't. That is unsustainable. And the government knows this. In an interview in March of 2023, Macron would say that when he began working, there were 10 million French pensioners, and now there were 17 million. It simply was not sustainable. In order to forestall what would become an inevitable collapse, something was going to have to give. and raising the retirement age seemed to be the only immediate thing that could actually work. A few more years of people paying into pensions, less people that were drawing from them. It is a completely realistic plan considering France has one of the lowest ages of retirement in Europe and yet one of the highest lifespans. So, Macron sought to gradually raise the legal age when workers could start collecting a pension by 3 months every year until it would reach 64 or 65 in 2030 and 2031. If nothing was done, it was going to end in disaster, as there was going to be nothing left for anyone. The people of France, though, as you can imagine, they did not take this very well. Protests and riots would break out across the country over the course of 2023. There were peaceful protests, yes, but if there is anything that France is famous for, it is revolution. And so things got out of hand rather quickly with rioting and looting. The French legislature was essentially paralyzed, and so having no ability to push through the law by normal means with a vote, considering how divided France was becoming politically, Macron decided to go with the nuclear option and invoke Article 49.3. Let me explain that. Article 49, paragraph 3 of the French Constitution provides that the government can pass a bill without a vote at the National Assembly, the lower house of Parliament, after a deliberation at a cabinet meeting. This is, by all accounts, a nuclear option as it completely violates and bypasses the democratic process, but is seen as something as a necessary step in order to be able to pass laws during times of crisis. In response to this, legally, lawmakers are able to file a no-confidence motion within 24 hours. If the motion gets approved, from more than half the seats, the text is rejected and the government must then resign. If not, the bill is considered adopted and passed into law. Since the Constitution was established in 1958 with the Fifth French Republic, only one no-confidence motion was ever successful, and that was back in 1962. So this is something that has been regularly done before, but it is still a massive use of power by the central government that even if it is arguably necessary, it is just about guaranteed to turn every single person you can imagine against it, both in terms of politicians and also the everyday people of France. Again, many governments have used it, mostly since the mid-1970s for various reasons, including accelerating the adoption of a bill and imposing a measure that did not have the backing of a parliamentary majority. Under Macron's predecessor, Francois Holland himself, Article 49.3 had been used amid a power struggle within the then governing Socialist Party, where a group of dissidents would contest 2 successive bills. So it's not out of the question. But the reason this was extremely dangerous now was because it was being done to push through something that was extremely unpopular with the average everyday citizen, not just a political party spat. And the following years within France were going to reflect this. Only a few months later, after Macron would face a beating in the European parliamentary elections, Macron would call for new elections within France to secure his party's power and stabilize his reign. Instead, the exact opposite would happen. And I'll need to explain that. President Macron would dissolve the lower house of France's parliament in a surprise announcement over the course of early 2023, sending voters back to the polls to choose new lawmakers, after his party was handed a massive defeat by the right-wing French party in the European parliamentary elections. Marine Le Pen's anti-immigration, more nationalist party was estimated to get around 31 or 32% of the votes, a historic result, more than double the share of Macron's Renaissance party, which was projected to reach around 15% of the vote. So, yeah, a new election was called, with the event being marketed as a thing that would save French democracy and the government and would give a mandate to the centrists to be able to govern. This was something that was seen as necessary. But that is not what happened at all. The new French parliament wound up sharply divided, with a leftist coalition facing off against Le Pen's party, with the centrists in between to rule as a minority, sandwiched by 2 larger entities that for the past 2 years at this point have sought to crush any action that the government launches that they do not explicitly back. There has been no functioning majority for years, except to say no to austerity and to topple prime ministers Gabriel Attal, Michel Barnier, and François Bayrou in quick succession. Government after government within France would be formed. They would struggle to do anything meaningful for a few months and then ultimately collapse, leaving the French state practically paralyzed. In the example just before the latest one in the summer of 2025, Bayrou had presented an austerity budget for 2026, which was endorsed by Macron's centrist alliance, but it faced opposition from both the left and the right. Bayroul refused to negotiate, and instead, he asked the assembly for a vote of confidence under Article 49.1 of the Constitution. The vote, held on the 8th of September, would result in a heavy defeat for him, with 194 votes in favor of the government and 364 against. The government was left reeling. A new government had to be formed a few weeks later under Sébastien Lecornu, which in turn would collapse in less than a day after his cabinet was announced. That is where we are here today. France is not able to do anything. The entire situation seems impossible, and the worst part is, it's not likely to be fixed. The opposition would immediately zero in on Macron, urging him to call new snap parliamentary elections or quit. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the right-wing National Rally Party, would say, and I quote, "This joke has gone on long enough. The farce must end," end quote. On the left, France Unbowed's leader, Mathilde Panot, would say, "The countdown has begun. Macron must go." No one, as it is, wants the current leadership in place. But the problem is that the polls do not actually indicate that anything is going to be resolved. Two opinion polls from last month show that in the event of snap parliamentary elections, voters are probably going to vote largely in line with what they did the previous year, with the RN ahead and the left wing being second, followed by the center forces stuck in the middle in third place, unable to do anything. Parliament would remain divided in 3 blocks, with none holding an absolute majority or even a slight majority to be able to do anything. These elections are held in 577 constituencies, and in many cases in 2 rounds, and their outcomes are extremely hard to predict. We don't actually know what is going to happen. As it is right now, my friends, there is no end in sight. The instability of France is only going to continue to hurt it, both politically and financially, spiraling into debt with rising interest rates and a political deadlock that makes it impossible to escape is truly an unenviable position. What the result will be, I can't actually say. It really is painful to talk about. France has rarely suffered a political crisis so deep since the creation in 1958 of the Fifth Republic, which is the current system of government. The 1958 Constitution was designed to ensure stable governance by creating a powerful and highly centralized president that would be endowed with a strong majority in parliament, and to avoid past instability. But instead, Macron, who in his ascent to power in 2017 would reshape the political landscape, he has continued to struggle since 2022 with a fragmented parliament, unable to do anything. France is not exactly used to building coalitions and finding consensus. They are used to being able to push through and do whatever is necessary. But that hasn't been able to happen. As it is, should the government splinter, who knows? We may see the rise of a 6th republic. After all, France has its traditions. Dear God, I hope at the time that I'm speaking about this right now that I don't speak things into existence again. That is it. I'm going to go ahead and end things here now before it is that I make things worse. With that, my friends, I really do appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching. If you are listening to this episode right now and not watching it because you've gotten access to this early through membership, then I do appreciate it. Thank you so much for the support. If you are actually watching this full episode that is fully edited by my editor out on YouTube, then by all means, you can go ahead and sign up for the membership if you want early access to future episodes. Essentially, what it is that I'm trying to do is I am trying to make my episodes as fast as I can. But since these things take anywhere between 2 to 4 or 5 days to edit sometimes, as soon as I record them, I am uploading them for you all to be able to see. I wrote this and recorded this the day after the French government collapsed, and I didn't want this to be wasted for like 4 or 5 days before things potentially change again. So if they have changed and you're watching this video a week later, it's not my fault. You had the opportunity to sign up for the YouTube membership. With that, my friends, though, we're ending things here now. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time.